Hello there. Welcome. This is Digital Foundry Direct Weekly, episode 220. It is, as usual, our show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. A fair bit to get through this week. Joining me, first of all, John Linneman. Hello.
Rich, that was such a chipper introduction. It makes me excited to be here on DF Direct this week.
I'm very pleased to hear it. And, of course, Oliver Mackenzie.
Yes, Rich, I'm back this week from some escapades with John over a couple videos, but I'm refreshed, raring and ready to go.
That was good,
escapades,
man.
Wow.
That System Shock video we did, that was that resulted in some unexpected laughs, I must say.
It did. It did.
Okay, before we go on, store.digitalfoundry.net is the home of our merchandising wares. If you want to help support the team in addition to the supporter program, do check that out. It would be much appreciated. But with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, so last week we posted our review of the Nintendo Switch 2, which was generally highly positive, I'd say, with one exception. We've stirred up a bit of a hornet's nest by basically saying that we don't like the display that much. And now we're going to sit on that hornet's nest by doubling down on everything we've talked about. John, basically there's been some follow-up stuff on the screen. To be fair, there were complaints about the screen before we did our review, but there has been now further testing carried out on the display, which kind of it kind of backs what we're saying, to be honest, that there are issues with the screen that could potentially be addressed, right?
Yeah. So this is, man, oh boy, this went nuts. So for starters, let me just be clear, and I think we can all agree that when we're talking about issues with the screen, we're specifically talking about two major things, and in this case, one major thing, the motion clarity and the poor HDR. But I think we can all agree that aside from that, the rest of the Switch 2 screen is pretty good, right? Like,
right.
It's, you know, there are some complaints you could level out, but as a handheld, it's vibrant, it's sharp, it's a good looking screen on the face of it. All right. It's just this motion clarity stuff. And so first, earlier this week, a Japanese site called Chimodog posted their first take on it. And they tested it and found the average response time to be around 17 milliseconds, which is over the 16 milliseconds needed for 60 frames per second. The problem, though, with 17 milliseconds is that essentially it means 90% of the time you're seeing a ghost frame somewhere. You're seeing blur somewhere on the screen, right? You only get like a 10% moment where it's completely clear. So that's already not great, right? But then our friends at Hardware Unboxed come along with their monitors unboxed channel, or not a channel, but, you know, the videos they do there, which are excellent, by the way. I do enjoy that content. And they actually found they were significantly more harsh, and also found that the response time was even slower, coming in around 30 milliseconds, which is, that's actually more in line with what my eyes perceive, I guess you could say, and with what we found with moving around the camera. But that's what I thought anyway. But then under that comment, we actually received a comment from Takiudon, who is well known in the scene. He's working on that FPGA system that looks like the PlayStation. It's a very interesting device. I do want to check that out. But also, he's done a lot of work on modding original Switches for OLED screens. So he's done a lot of actual work on this and works with displays. He actually found it to be more around 50 milliseconds. This does highlight how difficult it is to measure these screens and the response times. But it also suggests, you know, everybody has their different methods for doing so. And then on top of all that, the regular comment you see is, so wait, if you have to measure this stuff and put it in slow motion, why does it matter? And I think we can all say here that the issue is that for those of us sensitive to it, you always see it. And this is not new. This is not a new thing to the Switch 2. This is a long-standing LCD problem. I remember encountering my first LCD TVs back around 2004, 2005, and being kind of horrified by the lack of motion clarity, because coming off of CRTs, it was genuinely horrific. And I thought, oh man, this is not good. It wasn't until I experienced a plasma TV, which is still not as good as a CRT, but it's actually pretty close, that I realized there was a path forward at the time. And that was actually at the Microsoft demonstration in Tokyo for Xbox 360, by the way, where I saw a Pioneer Plasma for the first time. And I was like, what is this? Why is this so much better looking than every other flat panel I've seen? It was a Plasma. But so all of this stuff adds up. I've asked some people to do tests. Like, for instance, if you download Taiko no Tatsujin, there's a demo of this. That actually works like the test UFO from Blurbusters in a way, where the notes travel across the screen. There's text under the notes. You can see that as it moves, it's blurry, right? So why are we making a big deal out of this? Well, I think the current theory, shared by several different people so far, and something I've suggested as well, is that Nintendo has opted not to implement any sort of overdrive. I don't think this is a case of, oh, the Switch 2 has a bad screen. And I also don't think it's a panel lottery thing. I think this is actually down to how they're driving the screen. Which, this is actually a problem that Apple has had in the past as well with their LCD-based products, where they've also opted not to do any sort of overdrive or any adjustment to the screen. And the motion clarity on Apple LCDs before they switched to OLED was frankly atrocious. But most of those devices were also not really, you could play games on it, but that's not what most people used it for. So it was perhaps less bothersome. And technically you can save a little battery life by not doing that. But I'd imagine, from what I can tell, it's quite a low amount. Which basically means if you're tuning a screen for games, I think they simply made the wrong choice for this. And that by adjusting the screen to behave differently, they could potentially fix this issue. So I think it's important that we raise it. Not that Nintendo is known for listening or anything, right? But just flagging this as hey, we think that this could be better. And I genuinely do think that they could improve this significantly, because these tests also found, as we suggested, the Switch 1 is, while still slow, it is faster than the Switch 2 when it comes to this sort of thing. But one thing I'm interested in, Rich, and you actually have one, is the PlayStation Portal. I also remember motion clarity being really bad on that, but I don't own one because I really don't like the concept of the Portal. I don't think it's a great product, but a lot of people seem to have it. And I'm curious about that. I kind of want to look at it again now to compare it to the Switch 2, because there is this idea that it might actually be a similar screen. I wonder.
That's quite possible, yeah. I mean, we'd have to have a similar test to see how it actually pans out. That's going to be the challenging thing on that. And I don't really use the Portal that much, simply for the reasons stated in the review. It's inherently a compromised product where I don't want to play games on it. Not specifically because of the screen, but because of the latency and the image quality. Now, maybe that's improved since I took a look at it, but ultimately, remote play I don't think is up to snuff. But I see where you're coming from in terms of that test you came up with,
right?
For motion clarity, because I'm reminded of when the first LCDs came out. You watched a game of soccer to our North American contingent. And, basically when you watch one of those games, it's just lateral left-right movement. Mm-hmm. And whenever there was a camera movement, it was just a completely blurred experience there. So kind of lateral movement is kind of like the classic test for checking out LCD blur.
That's why side-scrolling games are so problematic, right? You play Sonic the Hedgehog on this, and it's a problem. But this brings up another interesting point. Why do some people see this and others don't? And I asked some people to check out Sonic Mania on the Switch too, and they played it. And the comment that caught my attention was someone said, "I just tried it. There's no blur on my screen. It looks great. Sonic himself is totally clear while running around." And I realized
he's the bit that's not moving.
Yes.
Really?
And so I actually posed a question and got a variable response. When people play games, their eyes often focus on different parts of the screen. The people that seem to focus more on the center, the character specifically, and only sort of glance where they're going, you can perceive the screen differently. I can do this at will. If I just focus on Sonic mostly and try not to focus on the background, it actually is slightly less distracting. It is just a matter of changing the way your eyes focus on the screen. So if you don't know what to look for, you've only used LCDs for 20 years, you're focusing on that kind of thing. I actually think it does change the perception. But for someone like me, the way I play games and the way my eyes naturally look at the image, that kind of blur, it actually causes like eye fatigue almost. Cause like, if I feel like my eyes are trying to lock onto details and it can't do it on screens like this. And I don't know. I think you can agree with me on this one, Oliver, as well, because you've experienced, you, unlike myself, I've eliminated I've eliminated LCDs from my life almost entirely. I don't like LCDs and they are gone, except for the Switch 2. You love LCDs, but the truth is, most LCDs, good ones anyway, they don't have this problem. So because they can approach the problem differently, right? There's ways around this. Actually, yeah. The MetaQuest 3, actually, let me just correct myself. That's actually an LCD. I like that. And they figured out exactly out how to strobe the screen in just the right way to get zero motion blur. It's super clean. So it is possible. But what about what are you thinking on this? You've seen the topic going around.
Of course, yeah. I mean, you'll still have like sample and hold issues on LCDs, obviously, as you would with any kind of display like
on
that.
OLED as well.
Yeah, on an OLED as well. But I mean, the higher end IPS LCDs that I have, the monitors that I have, even TVs typically are not nearly as laggy as a Switch 2 in my experience. And like with the Switch 2, I'm not sensitive to these issues normally, but I remember texting you, I think it was on June 6th, the day after Switch 2 came out, we were texting back and forth about how bad the image persistence issues were. It's so bad, like when I slow down some footage here, you can kind of see that by the time it's getting to that next refresh of the panel, you're just getting that like that last bit of the after image. I can imagine it would be pretty hard to actually perceive frame rates above 60 FPS in this panel, to actually see those frames, just because of how laggy it is. And it's like, yeah, it's just a really odd looking image persistence on the panel that people have talked about ad infinitum. So I'm not adding too much here, but obviously it is quite noticeable in our own tests here.
It's going to be interesting when Metroid Prime 4 comes along with 120 hertz support to see how much of a boost you're actually going to get.
Yeah, I think you could definitely perceive an improvement there, but it just like, it's weird for me because normally when I'm looking at a display, whether it's running at 30 FPS or 60 FPS or whatever the game's running at, I can tell immediately what frame rate the game is running at. Whereas with the Switch 2, it's laggy enough where it's kind of like, this is 60, but it doesn't really feel like 60. It feels like a weird kind of interpolated 60, like 60 with frame jet almost. It feels a little bit strange to me. So it's not giving me that immediate response of like, this is a 60 hertz panel running a 60 hertz game as I should be. But beyond those issues, like it basically seems like a fine IPS LCD from the hub tests here, from a lot of other tests that we see. The problem with IPS as a display technology is that it doesn't have very strong inherent contrast. There's IPS black and then there's local dimming, but this panel doesn't have either of those technologies. And then of course that really hurts your HDR presentation as well. So I think that really hurts, even though the panel itself is probably on net better than like a Switch 1 panel. There's been so much progression in mobile display technology and in display technologies in general since like say 2017, that when I compare my Switch 2's display relative to like a modern TV that I might have or modern monitor that I might have, that's a huge delta. Whereas my Switch 1, was competing in 2017 against like other edgelit LCD panels that were like dime a dozen back then. I feel like the ground has really changed here. But there's one thing I wanted to kind of clarify, because I think you basically alluded to this, John, but for those hardware on box tests, for the monitor on box tests, I think they're testing using a 3% to 97% threshold for color transitions, which is kind of like a wider gamut for color transitions, a wider range. Other sites are usually testing 10% to 90%, which is basically capturing more of the panel's luminance excursion, and that should roughly double the response time measurement compared to 10% to 90%. So I'm not sure what Taki is doing necessarily. He might have an even stricter testing methodology, but my suspicion here is that when we get these wildly diverging testing numbers in these panels, some people are like, is there a panel lottery? What's going on here? Is there potentially multiple suppliers in the mix? I'm not sure there's a supplier beyond Intellex, and if there is, I'm not sure it makes much of a difference. I think people are basically basically having different levels of testing methodology, where basically that after image is clearing, probably realistically, almost all of it is clearing in, 16 milliseconds or 17 milliseconds. But there is still a little bit of a fade there. There is still a little bit of a kind of luminance excursion beyond that point. And what Hardware Unboxed is doing is they're actually expressing that as the response time of the panel. So yeah, just depends on your methodology there, I suspect.
And there we go.
Yeah,
that's key.
Yeah, I mean, definitely do check out the Monitors Unboxed stuff that Tim's doing there, because it's really great. And I think he basically says that I am approaching this from a PC monitor's perspective, but it does also include the Switch 1 measurements as well. So, even if you're doing the Switch 1 to Switch 2 comparisons there's clearly issues with the Switch 2 screen. I think the one thing to bear in mind is, and again, Tim's review was pretty good. I think it's very balanced. Obviously, there are positive parts to the screen. It's just that for some people, the fact that you're getting a completely sort of blurred image on fast-moving content's a bit of a deal breaker. But functionally, it's okay. It is a 1080p panel. I think we've been surprised that handheld games have delivered 1080p or a decently upscaled 1080p. Which is nice. It's a good thing to have. But obviously there are those issues there. It's just, some people are going to be happy about it, okay with it rather. Other people, some people just won't be cognizant of what's going on there. Other people will be. And when there are issues, what you do is you look for proper data to tell you what's going on, and the data is not good for the Switch 2 display. I think that's the bottom line. Okay, let's move on to some supporter questions on this issue. This one from Peter. Good day, gents. Hope the week is treating you well. Regarding the Switch 2 screen, recent hardware box review suggests that maybe the poor latency is related to lack of overdrive on the panel, likely a power-saving move. If so, is it possible that this particular aspect of the display could be improved via a firmware update? Nintendo seemed to have a bit of grace regarding the promised 2 hours minimum battery life, so maybe they could afford to lose some more power on the display. Or indeed, is the system power balanced in such a way that this is not a feasible solution? Thanks as always for the great content, and have a lovely rest of the week! Exclamation point. Well, that's the key thing, right, John? I don't see that Nintendo has anything to lose. Assuming it's technologically possible to overdrive, right, then I don't see that there's any negative point in actually just providing an option within the system software menus to turn it on or off according to taste, right?
I fully agree, because we actually have an example of them offering display options with the Switch OLED, right? Where you could essentially change the color gamut to either be, the full gamut of the screen, or limit it so that it was displayed more like the original Switch, which is something the Switch 2 doesn't have, weirdly enough. But they could absolutely integrate something like this in the system settings option to allow for smoother motion. And I think that would be an excellent idea and a great choice. And I'm sure they could figure out a way to word it to make it obvious, like what it does. It is interesting that their very own welcome tour actually has a really good showcase of this in action, with the VRR test, where you can have the Switch moving across the screen laterally, also like the test UFO basically, and you can adjust the speed and the frame rate on the fly. And the difference between 60 and 120 is actually a lot less pronounced than usual because of the blur. But if you go down to about 15 FPS, the frame rate's low enough where actually you don't actually see any sort of blur anymore. So
right. Okay,
it's a fun test.
That's an interesting other way of testing the blurring of it, just by lowering the frame rate until it doesn't look like an issue anymore. I didn't really think about that.
I also recommend, by the way, sort of pseudo related to the screen, for anybody that's ever wondered, why don't you just lock the frame rate at 40 FPS or something on a 60 hertz output without VRR? Well, what I love about this test is that it allows you to unlock the frame rate fully, but you can both do it with VRR on or VRR off. So you can actually see how choppy, say 37 FPS looks with VRR off. And then you click the VRR on button and it looks super smooth. And this is the first time we've seen this kind of test on a console, right? So it really extols the virtues of this feature. It's just a shame that none of the shipping software actually uses it below 40 FPS, because obviously that is one thing the panel absolutely can do, all the way down to 1 FPS if you want.
We've got this other question here from Frustum-aligned Voxel Fog. Oh, illustrious conclave of rendering virtuosos, behold my verbose proclamation! Exclamation point. I should say that I did put in the call for supporter questions this week. Keep your questions short, because walls of text are quite difficult to get through on the show. Anyway, with the Switch 2 screen chugging along like an original Game Boy stuck in molasses, how soon can we expect aftermarket wizards to conjure up OLED or micro LED upgrades with HDR that actually dazzles? Well, I suspect that will happen, but I suspect it's going to be quite a limited market. And but Taki Udon must be looking at this, salivating. But I think the other thing that's going to be quite challenging is going to be finding a screen that does all of those things and supports VRR as well. So that could be tricky. Any thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah, I think just sourcing a 1080p HDR VRR 120 hertz panel, period, that fits a roughly 7.9 8-inch 16 by 9-inch display within that parameter, within that body, is going to be pretty tough. And I suspect that if one exists, Nintendo might have been the recipient party for that display, because that's a very specific list of display technologies to be present, because I don't know that there really is any other panel out there that is a mini LED panel or is a OLED panel, certainly, that has all those display characteristics. I don't think there is one out there in the market at the moment. So yeah, I would be very interested in such an upgrade. I don't think it's going to come imminently. Seems like a bit of a tall order, I would think.
John, you were talking earlier about the Switch OLED. Is there a specific game or a test? I guess you've already come up with one. Yeah. But if you had like the Switch OLED and then the Switch 2, one on top of the other, and you were running the same content, how that would be able to be to show the issue quite dramatically, right?
Yeah, I think so for sure. Like, so
Sonic Mania.
Sonic Mania is good for showcasing, especially if you can synchronize the two in order to like have the rolling demos play at the same time.
Right.
You can actually just watch the game sort of play itself, or just do the intro when you hit new game. I actually tested this because with the two Switch 2s I have here just to see if there's any variance. But you can just put the Switch OLED at the top, Switch 2 at the bottom, just hit A at exactly the right moment on both at the same time. And you'll see that whole intro play out where it just scrolls continuously for a while. And you can instantly see the difference there. So, provided you're not just focusing on Sonic, of course.
Okay.
The way I look at it is like, try to find, like, look for pixels, text, anything on the screen that's moving across the screen, and look at how it looks when it's not moving, and then pay attention to what it looks like when it's moving. And you'll see that it becomes wider because it's like a blur trails on either side. It creates this effect where the whole thing just kind of smears a bit. And that's the kind of thing that we're trying to fight against. I mean, Mark at Blurbusters has devoted like a huge chunk of his career to fighting this. So that's actually, if you really want to learn more about what this is all about and why it matters, I do suggest going over to Blurbusters and read up on it. He's got a ton of awesome documentation over there, tons of tests you can run. Like, that site is a treasure trove of information about the fight against blur on flat panels, right? So if you really are curious, you're like, wait, I don't see it. Why are people bothered by this? And you actually want to learn more, check it out, blurbusters.com.
Good stuff. Okay, and with that, let's move on. Okay, so this week we also saw the release of a patch for Fast Fusion on Switch 2, which is fascinating in a couple of regards. First of all, we're getting some tracks from Fast RMX ported over to the new game, but perhaps more interestingly from a Digital Foundry perspective. Obviously, when John reviewed the game, there were concerns with the DLSS upscaling. It was pretty basic upscaling there with a lot of artifacts. A new quote-unquote pure mode has been added to the game that basically removes all forms of upscaling, and you basically have dynamic resolution scaling that's ensuring that you get that silky smooth 60 frames per second. Now, Oliver, you took a pretty extensive look at this, right? So what's going on, and to what extent are things improved, and what's going on with those track remakes?
That's correct. So in terms of the pure mode, the new pure mode, maybe we can touch on the track remakes in a moment, but basically the new pure mode relative to the main 60 FPS modes, so like the performance mode, the balanced mode, you lose a lot here. So there's no dynamic shadows, no ambient occlusion, downgraded bloom, it appears like, missing lights. If I flip back and forth here, you can see there's some pretty stark differences. And this is before you even talk about any kind of image quality differences, anything like that. They really do strip out a lot of the game's lighting here in this mode. So that's important to realize. Now in motion, maybe you don't notice some of those differences, but certainly in stills and in like, deeper, darker areas of shade in the track, you definitely do notice some differences. But yeah, I think this is mostly designed to push the res higher, those exclusions. Yeah. And the res does go higher. So they say it's a dynamic 1440p. In reality, in docked mode, my tests had it coming in just under 1080p usually, going down to a low of about 864p in a particularly demanding track. So when you compare that to the balanced mode, it's like 504p internally, something like that. And it's going to a much higher resolution, a 1440p resolution using DLSS in that case. So that's certainly a very different rendering setup, much lower pixel count internally, but obviously using DLSS. But in practice, when you compare them, the image quality results are a bit mixed because pure mode doesn't have any anti-aliasing whatsoever. It's just relying on that higher pixel count, that DRS. So you get a lot of image flicker and aliasing, which is especially obvious as you look ahead towards the horizon line. And that's really important because that's where your eyes naturally want to track in a racing game. You want to see the next corner. You want to see the next curve. So you can turn into that curve, turn into that corner, and make that racing line there. So in this force level, for instance, the trees are just a mess of serrated edges and pixel popping. And in balanced mode, I do think it looks better here and more stable. Even though there's a lot of breakup and DLSS isn't doing necessarily a great job, I think it does look better. But sometimes the pure mode does look better than the balanced mode. Like in these shots, the area around the vehicle is much less aliased and much more coherent. With DLSS, basically those raw edges are getting exposed anyways in this instance, and the resolution is much lower than in the pure mode, so you're seeing a lot more of that ugly breakup around the vehicle. I also tested portable mode. There you're looking at about 360p to 1080p with DLSS in the default performance mode, and in the pure mode you're getting a dynamic res that goes between about 600p and 720p, notionally capped at 1080p, although I seriously doubt it spends much time there, to be honest with you. Ultimately, I think people can have their preferences, but in total, I'd probably prefer the DLSS modes. Now, one thing I do have to make a note of here is maybe a slight comment against the proliferation of modes, because Fast Fusion only has 2 frame rate targets, right, between docked and portable mode. They both have 30 FPS and 60 FPS modes. But docked mode has 5 modes at the moment, and portable mode has 3 modes. Again, to service 2 frame rate targets. That seems a little bit excessive in my view, and I think they should probably just pick one. It's obviously hard to unwind the clock after you've given people these options, but I think that's probably not the right way to go about presenting modes in a console title. But here, ultimately, I don't think the results with DLSS are that bad necessarily. I think this is just a really heavy game and a really challenging game for some of these upscalers to work effectively with. And ultimately, you're not getting that many pixels to work with in a game that's this good looking on the Switch too. So yeah, that's just unfortunate. But ultimately, yeah, I would not really necessarily recommend the new pure mode.
Right. Mm-hmm. There were hopes that we could possibly get some kind of like-for-like measurement between DLSS on and off with this. But it sounds to me like there's too many changes made to the core renderer to make that happen.
Yeah, there are a ton of cuts. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. John, you've tested this. Thoughts?
Yeah. Like one of the other changes they made is that when they disabled screen space reflections in pure mode, they replaced it with the dynamic cube maps, similar to what you see in Mario Kart World, where they sort of like are constantly updating them. So you still get reflections, but the normal SSR is gone. But still, it's, to my eye, it definitely looks pretty chunky in pure mode. It's interesting that they offer it. It almost feels like this is why we went with DLSS kind of thing. Because this is just like some raw pixels, but I'd be curious to see what it would look like if they enabled some sort of like post-process anti-aliasing even. Mm-hmm. Like good old FXAA, bring that back just to smooth off some of those edges. That might look nice. I'd be curious to see it. Maybe it's time for a 6th mode. I don't know.
I think the issue is that because there is no anti-aliasing whatsoever, then you're actually exposed to the full brutality of dynamic resolution scaling.
Correct.
You can literally see the game strobing between resolutions in some of the footage I'm looking at here that Oliver's supplied. So. Yeah, I think maybe, I'm guessing in a game like this, it's extremely difficult to provide some sort of middle ground without like having like a gigantic overload of even more modes.
Man, it's still like, when I look at this game, the thing that still blows my mind on top of all this is like, they're supporting it after launch with this, they're adding tracks to it. And like the main team for this game is like 3 dudes.
Yeah. So
right.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's such a small team, and they've remained that way for so long, and yet they're still able to create these awesome games and sell it for like a pretty low price, and there's just a ton of stuff in there, and they just keep adding and improving on it, which I think is just extremely commendable.
Yeah. Let's talk about the tracks that were added, because you've done some comparisons here, Oliver.
Yeah, so there are 3 returning tracks from Fast Racing Neo / Fast RMX here. So those tracks are Alpine Trust, Sunahara Plains, and Zen Show Habitat. So when Shinen announced they were going to be adapting some Fast RMX tracks for this title, my expectations were not that high necessarily. I thought they would be like a little bit more of a mild kind of facelift on these tracks. But no, they've essentially been fully remade with upgraded assets, much better materials, revised foliage in line with the other Fast Fusion tracks, great indirect lighting, even much higher quality snow particles falling in Alpine Trust.
Yeah, they basically GPU particles instead of their old solution, right?
Yeah, it looks much, much better, I have to say. And they're basically bringing the revised tracks in line in terms of quality, to my eyes, with the base Fast Fusion tracks. Like, they look really, really excellent. And you really appreciate just how much better Fast Fusion looks relative to Fast RMX, even though Fast RMX is still a great looking racing game. When you actually compare them side by side here, you can see on every level it's just so hugely improved relative to that earlier title. So it's super impressive here. They're also adapted somewhat in terms of gameplay. So you get the removal of the jump pads and the addition of mandatory and optional manual jumps, because that's kind of the key kind of gameplay feature in Fast Fusion relative to the other fast racing games. So I think this is a fantastic addition. It helps to pad out the game's content, and it's free, which is awesome. Yeah. My only thought here, and this is not really a note of criticism, it's just kind of a reflection here, is that Fast Fusion is generally slower than Fast RMX. So I did this capture at the base speed, the lowest speed, in both versions, and it was tough to line them up exactly because Fast Fusion tends to lag over time on the same track, which means that corners that might have been pretty tough to navigate in Fast RMX at any of the 3 difficulty / speed settings in that game are actually a bit easier in Fast Fusion to tackle, and it makes the track seem a little bit more sedate. So these tracks essentially are a little bit easier to navigate just within the kind of gameplay parameters that Fast Fusion presents relative to Fast RMX. But I think definitely on the higher difficulties, on the faster speeds, they're still exciting enough and they still feel good. And just the fact they're adding this high quality content to the game for free on top of what's already like a very low priced game that still manages to be like one of the best racing games I've played in the last few years for sure. It's a remarkable achievement, and it's a really special game, especially considering the extremely limited resources they apparently have to work with. It's just super impressive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was looking at some of your social media posts, Oliver, and you pointed out something quite remarkable, which is that, the popularity of the arcade racer has really declined in recent times. However, with Switch 2 at launch, you've got 2 incredibly good ones.
Well, 3.
Yes, plus Ridge Racer and F-Zero GX, of course. And then Kirby Air Riders later this year. So that's 5.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic.
And I bet Garfield Kart runs better on the Switch 2 even.
I actually do have Garfield Kart. I should test that. Yeah, a little deranged, but I do have Garfield Kart.
That went that escalated quickly, didn't it? Okay, right. Fast Fusion Switch 2. If you don't own it, buy it. It's really, really cheap. It's really, really good. It doesn't take long to download. Fantastic rendering technology going on there. And now you can see the difference between DLSS and completely raw pixels. Anyway, with that, let's move on. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft announced, in combination with Ninja Theory, that there's going to be an enhanced version of Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga, and it's going to be coming to PlayStation 5, but that enhanced version will be obviously brought to the other systems as well. And we were kind of a bit baffled at the time. It's like, okay, so what are the enhancements? And when's it coming out? And they didn't want to tell us, but now they do. So the game is set to arrive on August the 12th. Pre-orders are available now, it says, according to this press release. But what are the actual enhancements? Now, this is where things get interesting. Where it's got a performance mode. That seems to be the key enhancement here. And I'll just quote Microsoft's PR here. Where the original release was optimized for 30 FPS to deliver an immersive cinematic experience, the enhanced upgrade will include a quote-unquote performance mode to optimize for 60 frames per second. On PC, the game will offer a very high preset to push fidelity even further based on personal hardware. There are some other enhancements made as well. There's an enhanced photo mode. Something that I'm quite interested in actually is the developer commentary. Kind of reminded of like sort of, you remember the sort of director's commentaries that appear on Blu-rays and DVDs. I think just with the type of game that Hellblade 2 is, that's a really good fit.
Yeah.
And a dark rot mode, which is a gameplay mechanic from the original game that's been ported over. But obviously, I think the performance mode for 60 frames per second is probably the key thing. Now, back in the day when we looked at this, we used our Frankenstein's PC, which has the Xbox CPU and a broadly equivalent AMD GPU, and we could get to 60 frames per second, but there were some issues. Anyway, I'm kind of curious what you think about this one, John.
Oh man, I was just looking at this trailer again after the new one they put out for it. I'm just reminded of like just how darn good looking this game is. It really is among the best looking games I think I've ever seen. Just the quality of the visuals on display is tremendous. Yeah. But it's also, weirdly enough, it is one of the rare ones where I actually feel like the 30 FPS mode was not bad in that it did.
Yeah, it was fine, yeah.
Because, like, usually when developers say, oh, we have these cinematic aspirations, it doesn't really hold up when you're actually playing it. But due to the way this game works, and it's fairly constrained, it actually does kind of work where it really does feel more like you're looking at some sort of like film at times. So in that sense, it was fine. But still, I'll be very curious to see what they've achieved here with the 60 FPS mode, to see what kind of sacrifices have to be made to get there, because it is, of course, coming to Xbox as well. I expect that the PlayStation 5 version will probably look pretty much exactly the same as Xbox. I guess the only question mark here is, will there be PS5 Pro enhancements? And if so, is it just going to be a resolution boost? Probably. I don't know.
There's not really much more needed, is there? You've got 60 frames per second. That's going to be the interesting one.
Yeah, and honestly, with this game again, though, because it's so filmic, the way it's designed to look, extra pixels don't even really make that much of a difference, do they? Like, you can crank up the res. It reminds me of Cuphead with the way you could choose the resolution on that. And it's like, ultimately, you kind of couldn't tell. There wasn't that much difference because it's so heavily caked in these post-processing effects and all these other techniques to make it look as if you're peering through a camera lens. So, which if you watch a 4K Blu-ray, most of them are not going to be pin sharp. They are limited by the camera equipment, and that's exactly the look they're going for here.
I think there are a few obvious areas they could go down. Like UE5 games typically have not taken such great advantage of PS5 Pro, but obviously they could use PSSR or higher level visual settings. Those are two options, maybe less exciting ones. But there's also the issue of hardware lumen support. Because
exactly.
The game, when it launched, and as of right now, it only has support for software lumen, including on the PC. Now, could they include hardware lumen in a potential PS5 Pro upgrade enhancement? That's possible. And they might actually be hinting at that with the PC settings, because they're talking about a new very high settings preset for the Enhanced Edition, which to me sounds like, geez, could that be hardware lumen? That certainly seems like something that the team over at Ninja Theory might be considering, right, for an enhancement to this game that would legitimately bring that PC version up in terms of visual quality relative to the existing PC version and console version.
That's a very good point, Oliver. I agree.
Yeah, but beyond that, I mean, I'm definitely in agreement with John. I think this game at 30 FPS there's something about it that almost feels right with the kind of way they're trying to lay out a cinematic experience, with the way they're trying to simulate various camera lens effects in the game and film grade and things like this. I really feel like they're going for that cinematic experience. And it doesn't really demand very quick reaction times either, even though it is an action game, sort of. It's not a very Twitch-based action game too much. Going to 60 would also hurt image quality, but kind of like you said, I don't know that having a softer image quality with like TSR would necessarily hurt it that much visually. I think it would probably still look pretty fine. Actually, when I reviewed this game, when I covered this game with you on Series S, that version of the game still looked pretty good relative to the Xbox Series X version.
I agree.
So if the Xbox Series X version now just looks like the Series S version running at 60 FPS, I don't really have an objection to that. I think that would look pretty good, right?
Agreed.
Yeah, my only concern here, outside of any kind of like, possible cinematic discrepancies in the refresh rate that you might end up with, is the traversal stutter this game had on PC at the higher frame rates that people were targeting on PC. So I know when you're trying to target like 60 FPS and above on PC, even with powerful CPUs, you ended up with these traversal hitches, right? So I'd hope to see those eliminated from the console versions, if they were going to go to these higher refresh rates, and of course, hopefully lessened on PC as well with this enhanced edition.
Yeah, the 30, that's a good point actually, Oliver. The 30 FPS cap on the console versions kind of mitigates that to a great degree. It's very, very hard to see the traversal hitches, but the higher the frame rate you go, the lower you crash down when those things happen. So it would be nice to see some sort of change made there, improvement / optimization. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this one pans out. And I understand also that the Series S version of the game does not get that 60 frames per second performance mode, which is entirely understandable. I think just from, one thing that I am kind of curious about, have they moved it onto a different version of Unreal in order to make that 60 frames per second thing possible? Because there's a lot of CPU enhancements and optimizations made to the engine there that could have solved some of the issues we saw with our projections there. Anyway, interesting stuff. We're going to look forward to seeing that. And I guess it's happy days also for the PlayStation and PS5 Pro owners who get to actually experience this game. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so news has been revealed. Nvidia has announced the arrival of an RTX 5050. It's arriving in both laptop and desktop configurations at some point in the second half of July, and it's already been hailed as a waste of sand by. By Steve at Gamers Nexus. $249 product, 8GB GPU. It's using a cut down processor as well, as we are kind of expecting there. I don't know what to make of this one. I'm going to take a better look at the specifications now, refresh my memory on them. But John, what do you think about this? I mean, I don't actually mind. There's got to be a certain point where, okay, this product is cheap enough that you're going to accept things like 8GB of frame buffer memory. But, it does seem to me that we're still seeing not much gen-on-gen movement in the budget end of the market from AMD and Nvidia. Meanwhile, Intel are providing 10GB and 12GB GPUs at the same price or lower. It's not great for the budget gamer, is it?
No, it is still a tricky scenario right now on the budget side. My view on when you're looking at a lower budget for building a rig, I still think that going used is the best option. There is obviously a risk that somebody may have overdriven a card, but it's usually the case of somebody wanting to upgrade to the next generation. And usually the mentality when you're upgrading is to let a card go for a more reasonable price just because you want to move it. You want to get it out. You get that new card. This one, but then again, it's like they're saying, what, like $249, is it?
Yeah.
That man, that is like cheap as heck for a graphics card at this point. And when you're at that point, yeah, obviously cuts are going to be expected. And 8GB certainly makes sense there, given the cost here. So, without actually seeing performance numbers, it's difficult to say. And I'd be very curious about what what the standard performance is like without any sort of the additional niceties. But at the same time, you know, as someone that does not mind frame generation, this could actually be an interesting product in that sense.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to see what it can do there, because it could theoretically in some games, like imagine this being a card that would be well suited to playing something like Doom: The Dark Ages, right? $249. That game does have a ray tracing component. Of course, that game still runs on a 2060 even, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But you know, this is obviously going to be a better option than that, I would say. And so, yeah, for a cheaper gaming rig, it seems like the way to go at this point. Like this sort of class, it's like I have less issue with this versus like say a 5060, right?
Right.
Because the price is low enough where you're like, okay, the cuts don't really hit as hard. But again, this is just my info based purely on this announcement and some of the specs listed here. I'd be curious to see how it actually pans out in a real world scenario. And I've thought about, like, it would be fun to build like a small form factor PC at some point. Maybe when I upgrade my CPU or something and board here, I could try putting together sort of like a smaller build and put some lower spec graphics cards in there just to get a better idea.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at the specs now. I brought them up. It does look considerably cut down from the 5060. 3840 CUDA cores go down to 2560. GDDR7 memory goes down to G6, which basically means bandwidth drops from 448 gigabytes per second to 320. And power is 130 watts. There's a drop in power there.
Yeah.
The interesting comparison is going to be the 4060, because that has more CUDA cores, 3072 versus 2560, but it's got more memory bandwidth. It uses more power. So if they can deliver 4060 performance for 249, that's, you know, obviously we'd have preferred cheaper, right? I mean, some sort of head-to-head against the B570 from Intel, which is like 220 or something. I think the thing that we need to bear in mind is that this is quite a volatile end of the market, and MSRPs are indeed manufacturers suggested. So there's quite a lot of movement in that market. Keep an eye on the bargain forums, and you can often see that there is some, you know, if you can go quickly, there are some good deals to be had there. But, you know, you've got to be keeping an eye on the bargain forums all the time. If this does 4060 performance for 249, I mean, that's not fantastic. I'd have liked it to be, you know, 220. But it is what it is. It just doesn't really enthuse me that much. If it's slower than the 4060, well, I suppose it would still be okay-ish for those. You know, there seems to be this argument that's sort of wheeled out by AMD and potentially Nvidia. I haven't heard that argument yet, but the esports crowd, this product will probably work just fine for 1080p. We just have to wait and see. I mean, I will try and get hold of one. I will review it. I like cards that don't have a lot of performance, because half the fun is trying to get a decent experience out of them, and often you can. Same goes for the 4060. Just have to wait and see. Waste of sand, not sure yet. But, you know, I think the point is that Intel are bringing cards that have more performance or the same performance plus those plus extra memory. Has problems of its own, of course. Oliver, thoughts on this?
I kind of don't think this will be a good card for price performance, because it is priced at $250 American dollars. The 5060 is only $300 American dollars. So you're getting like, you know, 66% of the shading performance for 83% of the cost. Is that really a great deal necessarily if you're looking at this end of the market?
Good point.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, the thing to bear in mind, though, is that basically the lower down the market you go, and you tend to see the performance differentials close up. Going back to the last time NVIDIA did a desktop 50 class product, which was the 3050, that was an immense disappointment at the time. So, you know, I guess I'm going into this one hopeful, but ultimately the track record for 50 class products isn't particularly great.
Yeah, one cool thing about the 3050 though, is particularly the 3050 6 gig, is that it was extremely low power, and the 3050 6 gig was actually a sub 75 watt card, so it could operate just on PCIe power. And that still, to this day, I believe, is the fastest consumer graphics card that can run just on PCIe power. Whereas this card has a 130 watt TDP, which is only slightly lower than the 5060 at 150 watts. And it still requires one 8-pin power connector. Even though they could have gotten away with one 6-pin power connector, it's one 8-pin. So it is like, even in a small form factor context, it's still using like a very similar amount of power as the 5060. It's probably going to be using all the exact same cooler and heatsink designs as the 5060. At least that's what it seems like to me from my initial appraisal of the various models here. So I would really expect that this is not actually that interesting from an SFF perspective. It's really just like this ultra budget card, which, you know, at this end of the market, you do have the board, heatsink assembly, etc. All those costs become a larger proportion of the bill of materials. I understand why this card is $250, not say $200, even though the price performance is not really there relative to cards that are a little bit higher up the stack. So it really does seem like a card that's not even that interesting for SFF. It's really more interesting as just an absolute bare bones entry level card, which, you know, it could be good enough like for 1080p gaming in a lot of games, especially games that aren't very VRAM heavy. For esports titles, it's probably going to do a really good job. I also think one nice thing about this card is that it is going to replace the 3050 6GB for a lot of entry level gaming, and it is going to replace cards like the 1650. And this card is a much more capable class of GPU, has much more VRAM than those outgoing cards. So at least now at the low end of the market, if you're going to advise someone to buy an Nvidia GPU, at least you have an Nvidia GPU that has at least 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but has the full modern feature set that can run DLSS 4, that can run frame generation, that can run all these technologies. And maybe it won't be too fast. Maybe that 8 gigabytes of frame buffer is still a little bit limited, but at least it is like a real graphics card. Like a real graphics card that you can hold on to for a while, hopefully, with your esports titles and your older AAA and things like that. So that is at least positive, I think.
The thing is, Oliver, having visited computer shops in the US earlier this year, I actually found the real entry point for consumers. Under $100, still on store shelves, all by itself, the GeForce GT 1030.
Oh, the 1030.
The 1030 is still there. In fact, when I was there, they had no graphics cards left on the shelf that were modern, but they had a whole stack of 1030s, baby. So if you want your 2 or 4 gigabyte 1030, that is the true entry point. And you better believe it's super slim lines, ultra compact. It performs like a GTX 280 or something. But it's there.
Yeah, this would certainly be much, much, much more competent.
That is interesting, though, because I actually think that gives us an interesting point looking at the low end market, right? Like a 4 gigabyte 1030 is like around $100 or so, sometimes even more, right? For 150 more, right? You get to the 550 or the 5050. That's literally like 10 years of progress.
Yeah.
You know, it is obviously more than double the cost, but we're still talking like pretty low cost, and it's just funny to see that you can still buy this ultra cheap card that performs like an ultra cheap card.
Yeah,
because it is. But
you're going from a card that is only really useful for HTPC purposes and can't really run any modern game to a card that can probably run just about every modern popular game pretty well. So I think that's a big improvement for sure.
I think the 1030 is literally just a card for like people that just need video output. Their motherboard maybe doesn't have it. It's like, it's probably significantly worse than any recent integrated graphics even.
Absolutely.
There's just going back to the 5050. There is another component to this, which is that there is a laptop version which seems to have very, very similar specifications, and I think that's probably the more natural home for this type of product. I mean, Nvidia sell a huge amount of gaming laptops, to the point where the 4060 laptop is right up there in the Steam hardware survey. So I think that's probably a more natural market for this product. But I am expecting to see the 5050 desktop reviews to be quite brutal. But, you know, is what it is. Anything further to add, or should we crack on?
Let's crack on.
That's it. Let's crack on. Okay. More news this week. Big news, or, well, kind of big news. HDMI 2.2 has been officially confirmed, bringing with us just what we've always wanted. Anything up to 16K resolution. That would be 15,360 by 860 40 pixels. But there is a lot more to this than meets the eye. Potentially more useful applications for that extra bandwidth. John, thoughts?
Well, it is indeed a natural extension of HDMI. My actual first thought here is, after all the troubles we've dealt with HDMI 2.1 cables and manufacturers cutting corners and having to buy like 5 cables to find one that can actually do the job, I'm actually kind of concerned about these kinds of specs, because more and more it feels like the limiting factor is just like getting cables that actually follow the specification properly and can actually transmit the full bandwidth correctly without issues. It's not as easy as I thought. So
yeah, but HDMI, they've confirmed an Ultra 96 HDMI cable, which is basically a kind of validated cable that can support the full bandwidth, the full 96, is it gigabits or gigabytes per second of bandwidth?
Gigabits per second,
yeah. So, they're trying to actually ensure that there is a cable that will work to full bandwidth. Otherwise, you go down to the ultra high-speed HDMI cable, which
extreme high speed now.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts, isn't it? But yeah, I get your point. It does seem to be a bit of a lottery as to whether these so-called HDMI 2.1 cables are actually going to work or not. So yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of people are not happy about this Ultra 96 cable, but I think proper certification for a set level of bandwidth is kind of essential
necessary.
When we're getting up to, yeah, absolutely.
But still, like, we're talking like 16K 60, 12K 120. The way I look at it is that this is essentially future-proofing the HDMI standard. That's the idea here, right? Where it's like, okay, there's enough bandwidth here where any sort of display that manufacturers can come up with should be able to work within the context of this cable. So already HDMI 2.1 is pretty darn flexible. You can do a lot with it, but we are starting to bump up against the limits once you get to these ultra high refresh rates, needing to use sort of the display compression such. Not that it's actually visible in practice, I find, but this is good to see. And it basically means that, like, for instance, that Sony monitor I viewed, which was a 1440p that could do 480 hertz, we could theoretically start seeing OLED panels that are, native 4K, 480 or higher. And that's exciting. Will we finally get some, 1,000 hertz panels that can actually be driven by the bandwidth supplied by the new HDMI standard? I think that's very possible, because that's really where we're at now, right? Like, the big limitation on displays for a while has actually more been bandwidth when talking about these ultra high refresh rates. Of course, actually being able to render that many frames is another thing altogether, but still, it's cool to see. And I'm always happy to see this evolve. It just means that, I guess, the big question I have, though, is what this actually means for the TV market. Because on PC side, both HDMI and DisplayPort are common enough, but graphics cards typically just ship with mostly DisplayPort cables. The Nvidia cards, they have a single HDMI, for instance. So in the TV space, though, people mostly aren't doing these ultra high refresh rates, and consumer devices don't really seem to offer it. Like, I could see PlayStation 6 saying, we support 8K 120 or something, but it's not going to be a thing that we see commonly supported in the actual software. So it's just odd that HDMI is jumping up to this gigantic leap in bandwidth here, but the use case for it still seems largely pretty darn limited, I guess you could say, wouldn't you say?
I've got a couple of thoughts. First of all, I've got to correct myself here. The Ultra 96 cable is actually for bandwidth above 48 gigabits per second, and the ultra high speed HDMI cable is 48 gigabits per second downwards. So you're going to be needing an Ultra 96 cable to access this new level of bandwidth there. There's a few things which I think are pretty good here. First of all, the ability to do 8K 60 at full chroma is good. 4K 240 at full chroma, 10-bit and 12-bit color. These are kind of good things because, I mean, I've got a 4K 240 monitor. It uses DSC, compression there. I don't really mind it, but I guess having an uncompressed upgrade is pretty good there. And I think also if you are using DSC, we're going to be seeing things like 4K 480, which, at the moment seems kind of stupid, right? But, with frame generation the way it is and with the ever increasing GPU power, we are going to get there at some point, right? You're there already with some games, lower impact games that do use multi-frame generation. So, it's kind of a good thing. I do suspect the next generation consoles will probably use it simply because it will probably be supported at the design level by AMD, right? So it's probably going to happen, I think. So it's just a thing, really, as to whether games are going to properly exploit it outside of the PC space, which already has DisplayPort. I don't know. But we got some supporter questions here. Good A Team says, don't be a Richard. Does the HDMI 2.2 specification that's now available to manufacturers bring with it any advancements that will be of interest to the gaming community? I just think at some point that we will be reaching that point where frame generation is going to be maxing out various refresh rate limits. So it's good, right? Having 4K at 480 hertz, I think is a nice thing to have. And you're all about the refresh rate, right, John? I mean, in terms of motion clarity. It's awesome, right?
I've come around. I mean, not come around, but that's the thing that keeps me playing a lot of games on PC these days. It's just like that motion clarity. And it's also why, even with any artifacts that frame generation may bring to the table, and they are there, it's just that gigantic boost in motion clarity you get when targeting super high refresh rates that makes it worth it. Like, that is what I want.
Okay, so Oliver, 16K, are you excited?
16K. No, I'm pretty firmly of the belief that at typical viewing distances, perceiving anything more than 4K is tough. For me personally, 4K, 8K, I can tell the difference if you shove me 4 feet in front of an 85-inch panel. But at a normal viewing distance, am I really going to notice it? That's an open question. For 16K, now we're talking about literally 16 times the pixels of 4K. Like, there's at some point someone has to stop the display manufacturers. And I think ultimately the public are stopping the display manufacturers because only Samsung is kind of keeping up with 8K TVs every year, right? Everyone else has slowed their roll. So clearly the consumer demand for 8K as a display standard is not really there. And I think that's for a good reason. Here, it's going to be interesting to see exactly what this looks like on the AMD side / Xbox / PlayStation 6 side. There is a little bit of confusion here. I think the Ultra 96 standard is really just designed to unify that kind of cabling that you're using.
Right. Okay.
And then on the device side, you might have a display controller that can only do so much or whatnot. That could be a bit of a different issue there. But yeah, I think this is a future-proof display standard that will hopefully last for the console generation to come. Probably the console generation beyond that, to be honest. I don't know exactly how far display manufacturers are going to go in the TV space with like ultra-high refresh rates. Right now, the very fastest televisions that are in the market, like the LG G5 and whatnot, those are 165 hertz panels, right? So we're not anywhere near 240 hertz. We're not anywhere near 480 hertz, but presumably those will come down the line for next gen consoles. It remains to be seen exactly how well that will be supported. I still presume that 60 hertz will be kind of like the baseline spec because everyone has access to it essentially. And then 120 hertz will be very common. And then maybe 240 hertz will be supported in some more exotic titles, but I wouldn't expect it to be like super mainstream necessarily.
We got this supporter question from Todd Weitzel. Is there anything interesting in the HDMI 2.2 specification? Will 16K matter for anything other than the Las Vegas sphere? Can latency indication protocol save us from AV sync hell? Now, I had a quick look at the specification there and latency indication protocol. I'm just going to read out what it says. It's an advancement over existing AV sync methods for improving audio and video synchronization, especially for multiple hop system configurations, such as those with an audio video receiver or soundbar. That sounds like a pretty welcome enhancement, John.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So this is... this has been one of the most frustrating things when dealing with HDMI standards in general. It's just like, the compatibility between all the equipment. Like if you're just running one device into a TV and that's it, great, you're fine, it's easy. But like once you start bringing in AV receivers, multiple outputs, different capture devices, multiple displays and zones, and like really get it all together, which is what I do here, the chances for something in the chain to go wrong and misbehave increase dramatically. And when it does, it is very frustrating. So having any sort of mitigation for any of these issues that could pop up is frankly like an awesome addition. And I hope it actually functions as intended, because the transition to HDMI 2.1 was not simple, I would say. Not only did it take a long time for the devices to actually support it, but once they did, like there was a lot of finicky implementations and things that would work sometimes, and intermittent issues, and frustrating as all heck.
Mm-hmm. Out of interest, I just looked up the resolution of the Las Vegas Sphere, and it's 16,000 by 16,000 pixels. So, yeah, they're going to need a bit more than HDMI 2.2. It's getting there.
I wonder what they're using to power that thing. Multiple. It's probably just broken up into many displays or something.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the way forward there, but not quite there. They're going to need like HDMI 2.3 to get that job done, seemingly. Okay, well, we've still got some monitor talk to discuss, so let's crack on. Okay, so John, and indeed Oliver, you've bought new displays. Let's talk about them. John, let's go first. You've bought a 5K, 2K OLED display. Now, why did you do that, and is it any good? And what is it?
Okay, so this is the LG 45 GX9 display. This is something I've been waiting for a long time. I love ultra wide, but up until this point, ultra wide monitors were typically very limited on the vertical resolution. 1440p typically maxed out. This one supports 5120, so 5K width, with 2160 height, which means normal 3840 by 2160 content still fits on the screen just fine. Which that was sort of the thing that pushed me over. So you get all the benefits of 4K, but extra width. You get all those extra pixels. Of course, being an OLED monitor here, I was also interested in obviously the nature of OLED performance, which I love. But the other big feature for this thing that I was curious about is the dual mode. And this is something that's become increasingly common in the PC monitor space. And it's essentially like allowing a monitor to operate at a much higher refresh rate by effectively reducing the resolution. And this was my first experience with it. And when you do that, it drops down to 2560 by 1080 at 330 hertz. Why is this interesting? So there's actually a lot of like classic style games where like a resolution hit not only isn't a problem, but like it actually can be beneficial. Like, you know, play an original Doom or any of the 90s style boomer shooters. They arguably look more correct when running at a lower resolution because you're not meant to see that far out. So that didn't bother me. But what I like about it is that it essentially seems to turn like every 4 or 5K pixels or whatever into a single, like, you know, lower resolution pixel. So the image quality looks similar to like a somewhat nearest neighbor upscale that I really like on different scalars. So you get very sharp looking pixels and image quality that's actually shockingly good. Like you can see the pixels now, but it looks sharp. It's not like a blurry upscale. And it runs at 330 hertz. But when you click that button, it actually basically changes what all devices see the monitor as. So like even when you boot up Windows, the BIOS image that shows when you're booting Windows, like that will resize itself based on whether dual mode is on or off, because the display is seen as being a 2560 by 1080 display instead, which I thought was very interesting in terms of the configuration there. And sure enough, being able to play, I played through all of Sigil 2, the John Romero's part of Doom, at 330 hertz on this thing, and just it's unbelievably immersive. It's almost it's about as wide as a 48-inch 16 by 9 screen, but much less tall. So it sort of like wraps around your view, and just like the quality of the motion, the HDR performance is generally quite good. Not necessarily Oliver grade good, but good enough. For me, I still think it's quite bright, especially on highlights. It can get up to like 1200 nits around there or something, which is pretty excellent. I guess the big caveat that almost prevented me from going for it, the thing that was concerning, is that it has an 800R curve, which seemed extreme. And indeed, the first couple days I was like, oh man, this is too much. This is so curved. But I gave it a week, and now I absolutely love the effect. It's very immersive. And what I realized is that if you have a display this wide, like a 48-inch screen, but it's flat, the corners almost, without a curve, the corners feel like they're really far away from you, right? Anything you put up in the corner, it's like way up there, especially when you're in a 4K resolution. So having that curve sort of brings the whole screen evenly around your eyes in a way that I found really useful, both for work, especially work actually in Premiere, and also in games. And as I was able to tolerate the curve and to get to the point to love it, because I realized also our brains change. I remember I had a less curved but still curved LCD for a while, and I switched to the LG C2 as my desktop monitor, which is flat, right? And for the first week, it looked convex.
Yes.
Where the corners were moving away from me, right? Your brain is used to sitting there. So, of course, the same effect happened when I switched back to an ultra wide with extreme curving, where it looked like it was like way exaggerated for the first week. And then somehow I just realized like my brain just adjusted, and now it looks normal. It doesn't feel overly curved. It just feels like immersive. So, but for those worried about that, and I wanted to use a monitor arm, so this isn't possible with it, but there is actually still an adjustable curve version coming, apparently, of the same monitor, which allows you to make it flat or up to like being ultra curved, and you just kind of adjust it. They showed that at CES. There's still no release date on it, but at least there is that. But the key here is that we finally have an OLED monitor that has above 4K resolutions, very high refresh rate support, and it even has a new sub-pixel layout in a way that looks... It doesn't have any of the issues that the C2 had, where some of the text in Windows could look a little bit fringy, especially with anything with yellow, due to that specific layout. They've changed it a little bit, and it actually is improved, I would say, and it looks sharp. And because the PPI is now, I think, around 125 versus a C2, which was significantly lower, like text and everything is just ultra sharp, clean looking. And lastly, I guess there's the screen material. The C2, of course, was completely glossy, which I love the look of glossy screens, but it's true, during the day when you're working, the room does reflect in this. But I was worried that a matte finish would make it look more dull, but I actually really like the screen material on this. It makes it almost look like you're peering into a screen made of Vanta black, where it's just like this like infinite black material. So when you whenever I load up a game and it's just like a loading thing in the middle and the rest is black, it just has a super dramatic contrast that just looks incredible to the eye. You just get that ultra rich color. And yeah, so that's kind of my take on that. Also, when this monitor first released, there was actually talk that it had some flickering issues when using DisplayPort. That was due to a bug on the 59 or the 50 series cards from Nvidia. Nvidia fixed that, so that is not a problem anymore. It works great. I am using DisplayPort. There is display stream compression. I have not been able to visually see it, and I'm still trying to understand if you're even supposed to. It's supposedly lossless. I can't detect anything like that.
I think it is lossy, but
it is lossy.
Pretty good. Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of those things where I am unable to see what it is, and I've not been able to find a single example of anybody showing it. So, but even though I think this panel does get quite bright, and one of the key things is I can maximize a white screen like a notepad, and there's no visible loss in brightness. It doesn't dim down like a lot of the older OLEDs used to do. It stays bright, which is great, but it ain't bright enough for Oliver, which is where we get to Oliver's choice, which is a very, very, very different monitor.
Well, before we do that, the model number is the LG OLED 45GX950A-B. I've just been looking it up.
Just rolls off the tongue.
Yep. And I think we got to say, John, you did pay for this out of your own money. This isn't any kind of product placement or anything.
That is correct. I bought this for like $2,000. It was extremely expensive. Very, 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 very expensive. Like, this is the most expensive monitor I've ever purchased. Wow. But I was like I had to know, I had to try it. If I didn't like it, I would return it, but I ended up loving it. So yes, I bought this from Amazon, as you do. And also, if you want more actual technical details besides from this like conversational podcast chat, ratings.com did a review where they gave it an exceptionally high score, pretty much like 9s and 10s across the board, except for brightness, which is rated at 7.2, because so this scored better than the monitor you picked up, Oliver, in every metric except for brightness, which is again, I think it's very bright already, but man, it ain't like mini LED bright. Those things can like singe your eyeballs, and I know that you love singeing them eyeballs.
Yeah. So I bought a new monitor as well, which is a name that doesn't exactly ring off the tongue either. It's a BenQ Mobius, like Morbius, that movie, infamous movie, EX321UX. So not necessarily to use it as a PC monitor for productivity purposes, but to stick at the foot of my bed, angle down, and to play games and relax, like wire some cables from my consoles and my PC, have some fun, relaxing there, because my kind of like setup with my couch, that kind of feels mentally like a work setup now that I've done this for 4 years. So it's important to break that conditioning in this kind of way, right? And give yourself something that you can actually enjoy outside of capturing purposes. So I think it's pretty great. It's a 4K 144 hertz panel at 32 inches with a flat panel. So very unlike the 800R curve that John has there. Very unlike that. It's great for console gaming and quite good for PC gaming. Obviously for PC gaming, it'd be nice if it was 240 hertz. It's not perfect in that respect, but it does at least encompass, a pretty broad range of refresh rate support there. And it also is a 4K panel, which is nice. It is an IPS display, but it has 1152 dimming zones, which gives you pretty effective contrast and perfectly dark blacks in some circumstances. It also has great HDR, so it can go to 1600 nits in HDR content. And the kind of crazy thing about this monitor is it can do almost the exact same brightness and SDR content if you're a madman. And that includes full screen white. So full screen white, according to ratings, 1500 nits in SDR content, which is scorching. That is a flashlight. That is crazy.
Wow.
So for the first time with almost any display I've ever used, I actually turned this down in brightness in SDR content. I turned it down to 50%.
That didn't happen, Oliver.
Yeah, I actually do turn it down a little bit to 50 or 60% brightness even in SDR content, just because I getting blasted with that full 100% white, even on my TV, which does like 2000 nits and highlights in SDR if I want it to, full screen white is like 600, 700 nits, right? It has some ABL. This has no ABL in that circumstance. So it's like crazy bright.
That's insane.
Anyways, I do have a couple complaints about it, even though I do love mini LEDs and I do quite like this monitor. I think the local dimming could be more aggressive. So you get some elevated blacks in a lot of content, and it kind of looks more like an edge-lit VA panel in terms of contrast than a display with over 1,000 dimming zones. Because when you watch movies, like the black bars sometimes don't fade to full dark there. They're actually a little bit gray, which is a little bit odd. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent blooming behavior, right? And it's true that there's not much blooming on the panel. The control is quite good there. But as a kind of compromise, you only actually get a very deep, pure black with no backlight glow in very dark scenes. So let's say you have like a loading screen that's pure black, except for an interface element in the corner, that's going to look perfectly good, right? But if you have like a semi-dark scene in a game like The Last of Us, where you're in relative darkness but not complete darkness, you'll actually get a little bit of that backlight glow in there, which I'm not a big fan of. And most mini LED panels do not have such conservative backlight control there. But it is quite a nice monitor overall. It even comes with a remote, which is fantastic. I've never had a monitor come with a remote before. That's quite a cool thing to control it more like a TV. There are some better values, but if you're specifically looking for a flat 32-inch mini LED monitor with high brightness, this is the best option out there. And I'm not suggesting this is the best option for anyone, because I do like my bright displays. We have very different approaches between myself and John. I think for me, having as much brightness as I can get and having that level of brightness control is really important for me to get like a good, bold HDR impact and for me to get the brightness that I do want in SDR gaming as well. I hate ABL in bright scenes. I want that consistent luminance. For now, I'm sticking with mini LED, but I could totally see, in the near future, in the next few years, switching to OLED, actually, because there have been big improvements in OLED panels and the TV side of things. Like when you look at the LG G5, that is actually a pretty bright panel. It goes to 400 nits full white, which is not like outstanding or anything, but it's kind of getting closer to a level where I would be really happy with that panel potentially. If that technology hasn't quite percolated down to the monitors yet, but you'd presume that technologies like tandem OLED, like micro lens array, things like this will end up in many monitors in the future, in OLED monitors, and that kind of technology will allow you to achieve really high levels of brightness, hopefully, in OLED monitors. So, ultimately, I do think OLED is probably a superior display technology, but if you're like me and you're just a stickler for no ABL, super high brightness, you don't really care as much about clarity and motion, you're not really sensitive to things like that, then I can completely recommend this monitor as a very good option. Even though it is a little bit on the expensive side for what you're getting, I think it's quite a good one.
How much was it, Oliver?
In Canadian dollars, it was $1,500, which is like 1,000 American dollars.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
that seems to be the MSRP. I suppose the sort of side benefit of having a monitor that's so bright it can actually kill all bacteria in front of you probably a good thing to have as well.
Thinking of that, Oliver, have you ever used the Atomos products? So I use these for capture, like the Shogun 7, for instance, that I have here goes up to 3,000 nits. And that's obviously meant for like monitoring, like film productions, right? That's why it can do that. But like when you crank up that thing to the absolute max brightness and you're like pushing it, it's actually like painful to look at. It's so bright. But also if you're pushing the brightness really high, it makes the device get extra hot. Like the case becomes so hot that like touching it, like it's like kind of feeling like it's absolutely nuts how bright and how hot that thing runs. But it is fun to see these like ultra high nit screens that are typically reserved for like production work, not consumer displays. But still, I don't know if that's bright enough for you still, Oliver. We need to get to 10,000 nit displays.
Yeah,
there's a point. Where
you gotta wear the sunglasses sometimes.
Yeah. Some sort of Alan Wake approved display.
Oh my god, that would be an amazing character in an Alan Wake. Like Oliver sets up Alan with the brightness necessary to take out the creatures.
Okay, fair enough. And I guess, Oliver, again, this was not a product placement. You've bought that with your own cash money.
Yes.
Which I think is worth pointing out. Okay, then. Well, thanks for that. I've not got any plans to upgrade my monitor at all at the moment. I've got two. I've still got the 48-inch LG CX, which I use for production work. But literally in front of me here, I've got the Alienware QD OLED, the 4K 240 hertz one.
I should also note that my C2 is still in use. It's off here to the left. And I actually loop it through the capture card for monitoring console outputs. I have a second Switch 2 dock on it, and I can switch PC over to it if I want something like a flat 4K screen. So the C2 ain't going anywhere.
Fair enough. Good stuff. Okay, well, that was the news. Let's move on now to Supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I ask our supporters to suggest topics for the show and, of course, questions for us to answer. I choose the ones which we're best equipped to answer. And, well, this one's quite topical. And in fact, it's two questions which essentially ask the same thing. This one from Taylor. Hi, gents. Looking back through DF's graphics of the year results, each Decima game since Zero Dawn has been the quote-unquote winner in their respective years. Does Death Stranding 2 2 do enough to potentially continue that streak despite its raster-only nature? What are the key deficiencies in the current visuals that ray tracing could improve? Spoggy99 asks, "Dear DF team, hope you're doing well!" Exclamation point. Death Stranding 2 doesn't use ray tracing, yet it's easily one of the best-looking games I've played on PlayStation 5, especially on PS5 Pro. I think this highlights how far traditional rendering techniques can still go when pushed by the right team and built on the right engine. On consoles with limited GPU resources, is it smarter to focus on great character rendering, material work, and lighting effects rather than pushing for full RTGI? Interesting question there, John, bearing in mind you took on that particular project. It's a bit of a tricky question to answer, but ultimately it's really about what the developers want to achieve, right?
Correct. That's the thing, is any technique is essentially a tool, and you use that tool to create your vision. Ray tracing is just another one of those tools, and yeah, it obviously has its major benefits, and there's plenty of areas in Death Stranding 2 where you can see, like, oh yeah, if we had ray tracing here, it would definitely benefit the scene, especially like in the forest area. But at the same time, you can also tell that everything about the visual design in that game was very specifically arted up around the techniques that they knew they were going to use, right? And just as throughout all video game history, that's what we see. It's like, it's a perfect example of a great marriage between solid tech, but then leveraging the tech they do have to make something that looks beautiful thanks to a very strong art direction. I mean, obviously there is that through line back to something like Metal Gear Solid 2, right? On the PlayStation 2, which frankly looked almost like a generation ahead of most year one PS2 games. Yeah, I would say, like, they very specifically use the tech to do super interesting, beautiful things. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here as well. And most of the game's environments are these large, open, outdoor spaces. Their probe GI setup is more than adequate enough to handle most of the scenarios that you encounter in this specific world. So as a result, it makes sense then to sort of save on resources, even though, again, RT would have been nice. So that's the thing, right? Whereas a game that is built around ray tracing, like Doom the Dark Ages, for instance, has a RTGI enabled. Due to the way that they used to bake out lighting and the way that it was done in Doom Eternal, they couldn't really do that again for Doom the Dark Ages due to the massive size in the maps, the increase in size of the maps. The lighting data required would have meant that you'd looking at a 300 or 400 gigabyte game or something. It's just ridiculous. And it also makes designing the levels a lot more difficult. And that's a game where it has these very intricate kind of levels, where Death Stranding 2 is more outdoor sort of terrain, and the level design comes from the individual bases and spots that you encounter during the campaign. So, I mean, it's just a different use of a different set of tools and their own approach. And yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. So I think ray tracing is a great solution, and we should still push for it when it makes sense. But for sure, it doesn't always need to make sense, especially on these consoles where we're still limited with performance, right? And they obviously chose to favor sort of this higher quality image without these features, while still getting away with 60 frames per second, which makes a lot of sense with the long distance views that the games has. So, yeah.
It's interesting, I saw a tweet saying, no ray tracing, no nanite. And it's quite interesting that the one of the criticisms you have in terms of the mid-distant detail there actually would have been fixed by nanite.
Correct, exactly. That's the one problem.
And, ray tracing does, you can have a game with great image quality that uses ray tracing. I guess a good example of that would be Indiana Jones and the Great Circle.
Yeah,
sort of around 1800p native resolution there.
I would say Spider-Man as well. The Spider-Man games on PS5.
Yeah, sure.
They have great ray trace reflections, and the image quality is still excellent. So
yeah, so it's basically the tools that the developer wants to use to achieve their vision, really. Anything to add to that, Oliver?
No, I think there is definitely a case to be made that on current gen consoles using a ton of RT isn't a great idea. And for the most part, we actually don't see a ton of use of hardware RT on consoles. Most games are sticking to one effect, maybe two effects. It's oftentimes a little bit lighter than we see on PC, oftentimes very light relative to the full RT or path tracing implementations we see on PC. But I think going raster only can limit you somewhat and can complicate production. Really depends on the game. Like, obviously there are huge improvements with a title like Doom the Dark Ages in terms of being able to have a really consistent, really great looking world that's easy for the artist to work with and does not require shipping massive amounts of lighting data on disk, right? That's a huge improvement. But I do think, like, in general, there are games that I think are like begging for RT that don't have it, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for instance, which has like, you know, just this UE4 open world lighting, does not look very good. They're running out of data. They're using probes. It just kind of does not look very good there. But then there are some games like Expedition 33 that do have extensive RT where it's like, I think it's good that they use RT. I think it probably helps a lot from a production perspective, and I think it produces good looking visual results. But you look at that game and the size of its environments, and it's like, yeah, they could have like baked out some, you know, GI, and they could have just used SSR, and it would not have been a big deal, right, to that game's overall visual presentation. So I think it really depends here. But I think for Death Stranding 2, for sure, going with this kind of raster only approach seems to have produced the results they were looking for. So I think in their case, it was the right choice, probably.
And also, they very specifically choose techniques per scene, like that fireworks scene, right, that I showed in the video.
Right.
Very specifically for a scene like that, they're like, okay, how do we reflect the particles? SSR wouldn't cut it. They can't do ray tracing. Ray tracing actually wouldn't even be that well suited to tons of particles like that. So they're basically doing like an equivalent of kind of like planar style reflections where they're drawing it twice. You're just doing the particles, you know, above and below the ground in that way, and then blending it with the rest of the reflections. So there's just a lot of smart trickery in there that achieves the desired visual effect, even if it's not using the most high-tech features, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair enough, yeah. What about this point about Decima Games winning graphics of the year? Do you think, well, I'd say Death Stranding 2, certainly a contender, right?
Yeah, I would say it's a contender. It's probably going to be on the list. Whether it's actually the winner, I can't say. And that's difficult because there are some heavy hitters this year as well. So it's going to be a tough one. And
we got another 6 months.
Yep.
Still to go. Okay, let's move on. We got this question here from Edna Mode. The potential transition of Xbox away from dedicated consoles to a more PC hybrid approach makes me wonder about the low-level APIs / optimization that define console video games. Is low-level, quote-unquote, coding to the silicon already sort of dead in the new age of multi-platform games, barring some first-party Switch games? Interesting question, right, John? What do you think?
So from what I understand, while this like low level coding is not like the most common way, there is still some of the stuff being done these days, for specific things, right? I can't think of the examples off the top of my head, but I actually spoke with a developer not that long ago that was doing some kind of like super low level stuff, for parts of the engine and parts of the game, just to get certain things to be extra fast, right? And also, if you look at what id Software did with Doom the Dark Ages, right, and you actually can, like, they're so specific about the way they handle, like, memory reads and writes and the location in memory, and they're kind of, like, taking a lot of that approach, right, where they're very much paying close attention to, like, where things sit when they actually go into RAM. And so that they minimize the latency when you need to read and write between different locations, right? So, like, it's that same kind of, like, low-level design that you often hear people talk about when they talk about optimization, is paying attention to the nitty gritty to massively increase performance where it needs to be. And I think that's kind of the big thing, and it is still around these days, even if it's not like the norm necessarily, right?
I think there's just a general advantage to just having to develop for one platform.
Sure.
That, you know, it just makes development a lot more streamlined. And I guess, you know, the sort of ultimate example of that is, if we go back to the classic example, The Last of Us Part 1, the PC port of that, using equivalent level hardware on the PC space to what's happening within the PlayStation 5, there's a huge gulf in performance. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that a lot of to make the game work on more PCs, they stripped out a lot of the asynchronous compute stuff that was built specifically for the PlayStation 5. Might be wrong on that, but it would explain why there's this yawning performance chasm. Oliver, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I kind of think more about the things that make each platform unique, because there are a lot of exclusive Switch and PS5 games still, and we do see issues porting, in particular with these Nixies ports, porting PS5 games to PC, in some cases PS4 games to PC. In some cases, perhaps that's issues with async compute, perhaps that's issues not having hardware decompression, perhaps that's issues with just dealing with a non-unified pool of memory in a game like Ghost of Tsushima, right? So like these aren't necessarily things that require like super to the metal coding, but these are elements of those systems that don't necessarily translate onto other platforms very well, and do take advantage of the discrete elements of these systems that make them unique, that can make them unique. So in the Xbox side of things, perhaps that's going away. Perhaps it was not really as much there to begin with in the first place. But I think people will continue to do interesting stuff with these fixed hardware platforms that do have unique features. And I think we see that on Switch 2 and PlayStation 5 at the moment.
Yeah, there's also elements of a game that are difficult to translate. You know, I'm just thinking to the variable rate shading solution that was developed by Infinity Ward for Call of Duty, which certainly in its early days, I haven't really kept up with it, to be honest, but certainly in its early days, it was kind of using the MSAA hardware within the GPU to do crazy things that it was never designed for. And I think they probably could have maybe done that on Radeon cards for PC, but it would have been a problem for Nvidia, so it just didn't happen there. But that was going back to like the original reboot of Modern Warfare 2019. Certainly an interesting thing, though, and I do think, you know, you pointed out in your Death Stranding 2 review, John, that it was, you know, a game built for PlayStation, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very much. And obviously, if Death Stranding 1 is any indication, we will get a PC version, probably other platforms eventually. But their approach is kind of interesting, where they're basically rolling out one after the other, right? They're not doing a bunch of versions at once. It's like each version gets its own dedicated development time.
Yeah. And the Xbox version, in fact, which, you know, kind of conclusively proved that Decima does and indeed can run rather well on alien hardware, so to speak.
Indeed.
Which you know, actually isn't that alien.
No.
If you think about it, still much the same thing. Anyway, let's move on. We got this question here from Amjad. Hello, DF, long-time listener, but this is my first time writing in. I've always agreed with John that 60 frames per second is a design decision. There used to be a general sentiment that console gamers didn't really care about 60 FPS. However, this generation is the first time console players have had a real choice between performance and quality modes. We now have data during PS5 Pro release showing that around 75% of players on PS5 choose performance mode. Historically, console gamers never had this choice, nor did we have data to understand their preferences. But now that most gamers clearly prefer 60 frames per second, shouldn't developers start designing their games with that as a priority? Again, I'm going to come to you on this one, John. I think maybe there has been a bit of a shift that was maybe enabled by cross-gen. Opened the door to 60 frames per second, and it's kind of stuck about because, you know, people clearly like it.
I would say, he says, shouldn't developers start designing their games with that as a priority? I would say they already have. If you actually run the numbers and you look at all games released across there and try, like, I don't know the date on every single game, but a lot of them. And there's a lot that you can extrapolate from that. This is the first generation since the PlayStation 2 era where, like, the majority of software is like 60 FPS. And in fact, it's higher than that. Like, nearly every game released today is 60 frames per second on consoles, right? It's a gigantic shift from the last two generations. Like, 30 FPS modes are actually kind of like the minority here. Like, you don't see them as much. They're still around, but like in some very big expensive titles, but by and large, everyth's 60. I think that's awesome. So we've definitely seen a big shift away from targeting lower frame rates now this generation. So that actually matches up. And I've always argued that even if you can't see, like, explain the difference or notice it, you can feel it in a way. It's the reason why I think a game like Call of Duty became so popular when it did, because it was one of the only shooters, big multiplayer shooters on consoles during the PS360 era that did 60 FPS. People may not have understood that it was 60 FPS, but when they actually played the game, they sure felt it. They knew it. It's like, this feels good, and 60 FPS is a big part of the reason why, and that they stuck to it. Most of the more popular games in the world, when you look at those numbers, especially like, you know, anything on consoles, I mean, 60 FPS is kind of just like, they all run at 60 FPS for the most part.
Same with the racing games. I mean, Forza and Gran Turismo.
Yeah.
I mean, they dominated the field in that particular era, and I think the frame rate was definitely a key part of it.
Absolutely. That era, you're right. That was a notorious era for low frame rate racing games. I mean, even Criterion Games, after the brilliant Burnout Paradise, had to drop down to 30 FPS for their Need for Speed titles, right? Which was just like, what a shame, right? But like Gran Turismo and Forza, especially Forza, really stuck to their 60 FPS guns, and it paid off, I think. So yeah, I've maintained that console players care more than people might have thought for a while. They can feel it. And when given the choice, I think most people do tend to go with the performance modes, just because for games, it feels better.
Yeah. And we do have the data now to support that, thanks to Sony, right, Oliver?
We do. Most people, like this user is saying, 75% apparently of players on PlayStation 5 choose performance mode. That was indeed part of the telemetry that Mark Cerny brought up when he was introducing the PS5 Pro. He was saying players have this preference for performance modes, but they aren't getting the image quality that they would get with these 30 FPS quality modes. So why don't we give them the best of both worlds with PS5 Pro? That was kind of part of his pitch in that initial 9-minute video. But yeah, people clearly have a very clear preference for 60 hertz software. And I do think that most commercial games should aim to have a solid 60 FPS mode. There might be some exceptions like GTA 6, and I would have said a few weeks ago, Hellblade 2 would have been another exception, obviously. That's a title that's since been brought to 60 FPS. So perhaps that's less of a good example there. But I feel like the consoles are powerful enough to realize most game concepts at 60 hertz, whereas I felt in prior generations, like certainly during the 360 generation, you really felt a big trade-off between 60 FPS software and 30 FPS software. There was a very, very clear divergence in the capabilities of a game like, say, Red Dead Redemption versus a title like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the original Modern Warfare 2, I should clarify. There was a very clear difference in terms of what you could achieve, the kinds of environments, the kinds of complexity. Also, just like rendering a big open environment, that was the kind of thing that you could not really do credibly at 60 FPS for the most part, right? You really needed that extra GPU grunt to realize those environments in a credible way, in a way that would seem realistic and plausible to people at that time. Nowadays, what we tend to see is not so much this epochal difference between that 60 hertz and that 30 hertz update. It's just a small image quality difference in so many titles. Like it's the difference between 1440p and 4K. In a title like Death Stranding 2, John highlighted that on PS5 Pro, there's barely a difference at all in terms of image quality, even though the only difference is in image quality. Even on PS5 regular, PS5 non-professional, there's still only a relatively small image quality difference between those two modes. I think that in that case, definitely the smart money is just to pick the 60 hertz option and just let it be, right? Not to really think about it too much, just because it feels so much better to actually play with that additional temporal update there.
Yeah, it is interesting that there is this kind of push against upscaling in the PC space with a lot of PC enthusiasts, but you know, especially on console, you see just how much of an enabling thing it is for delivering really good performance. Anyway, let's move on. Next question. This one from Tagon86. Should we be worried about Switch 2's image quality / performance long term, since we are already seeing games rendering at 360p? Oliver?
Short answer is yes, I would be, but there are some caveats, right? So the game you're referring to, Fast Fusion, it presents a lot of problems for upscalers, and for obvious reasons. And I think that slower games that operate even within similar resolution bounds and still using DLSS, like Hogwarts Legacy is one example, they often look a fair bit better. They can look a fair bit better. And I think in general, PS4 class software probably also does not need crazy upscale ratios to look good and to work well in good performance on the Switch 2. So I wouldn't be too worried about it for a lot of titles that are going to come to Switch 2, which are kind of in this PS4 class in terms of visual technology, in terms of hardware load, in terms of ability to scale to the hardware. But I would think that for really demanding AAA ports with like virtualized geometry, with RTGI, with all these systems that developers might attempt to bring to Switch 2, like we're seeing with the upcoming Star Wars Outlaws, just as one example of, I'm sure, very, very many games to come that do use those kinds of systems. Those games will have to cut res hard, in addition to a myriad of other changes that include cuts to all kinds of settings and potentially really big cuts to all kinds of settings there as well. But I do think that if those games are sufficiently slow-paced, even with kind of this DLSS abuse, they can cover up that image breakup with motion blur maybe, and if the game is a little bit slower-paced, at least from the results that I'm seeing in Hogwarts Legacy, maybe that could actually be okay. And maybe the fact that the Switch 2's quote-unquote DLSS light is so good at just resolving a crisp, clean, stable image when the camera's at rest, maybe that kind of makes up for some of these flaws in motion potentially, right? So I think with those titles, the more important thing is just getting them at a reasonable level of performance in the hardware, and then image quality will be kind of a secondary concern, and you'll be lucky to have like decent image quality. So yeah, I would be concerned, but I think those kinds of games, you always have to accept some degree of compromise there.
Right. Okay. John, I think in your Fast Fusion review, you might have coined the phrase DLSS abuse.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested in your response to this question.
I mean, there's always this is something that's not really gonna change, and people ultimately abuse the Switch 1 as well with some insanely low resolutions on there.
Yeah.
We're gonna see the same here, I think, just as usual. I just think they essentially shifted the needle a bit higher, and like 360p on the Switch 2 with DLSS is going to look better than 360p upscaled by the Switch 1, for instance, right? So even if we're talking low pixel counts like that, you'll still get better results in the newer hardware. I think by and large, though, I'm not too worried about it. I mean, I don't expect world-class image quality across the board on Switch 2 games, but I do think it's still going to be a marked improvement over where Switch 1 was, which is to say Switch 1 was often still very much in like PS3 era image quality by and large, right?
Especially like all those like UE4 kind of AA mid-budget games coming over at like, 400p with that really blurry Unreal TAA and all the settings cut out, and it just there's so many games like that came over to the system, and you look at them and you wanted to cry. And then of course 30 FPS with uneven frame pacing, and I hope we see a lot less of that, if any of that at all, on Switch 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one from Paul Calamata. Will adding ray tracing effects be a common means by which to remaster or re-release a lot of current generation titles in the PlayStation 6 era? Games like recently released Death Stranding or Final Fantasy Rebirth already look spectacular with non-RT rendering and run at pleasing resolutions and frame rates. Would overhauling their lighting systems with ray/path tracing be the most obvious path to make them appear generationally better when the hardware is capable of supporting this? It's an interesting question, right, John? Because I guess thinking back to like your Doom to Dark Ages video you did with Alex, where you had those real-time head-to-heads between ultra-level ray tracing and path tracing, it was kind of like interesting that a really good RT implementation had a bump in quality from path tracing, but it wasn't kind of like the spectacular improvement. But I guess with the PlayStation 6, there probably will be the chance to actually retrofit RT to a whole bunch of games that never had it in the first place. And it could be pretty good, right?
It could be. I agree. It would be very nice, but I think that raises a lot of difficulties and questions, right? Because, these are games built without ray tracing features at all. Implementing them in there and replacing systems that already exist and where art was created for those techniques, that's not a trivial thing. That's a lot of work and may not even always be possible. Like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for instance, that's an Unreal Engine 4 game still. We know UE4's ray tracing support is not good. I don't think they could very easily do it at all with that game without like essentially doing like a full on like UE5 port And like,
Exactly.
I think it would require a lot of work to get up to speed on that. And it wouldn't just be like flipping a switch on settings. Cause like these games were built very specifically in this way, right? Where I think it could work is if games that already have some sort of ray tracing where they could expand the ray tracing support, make it look better than it was. Maybe even like, if the power's there, who knows if it will be, maybe even path tracing, right? Like when you already have ray tracing implemented and you switch to path tracing, it's more of a natural conversion process. I think it's easier to get that done, although not trivial, of course. In that case, I mean, so those sorts of things would be nice. I agree. It's just going to have to vary per game to game. And it did make me think, though, we've actually seen path tracing on consoles once this generation, haven't we, Rich?
Go on.
Minecraft on Xbox Series X. We saw it. We
saw it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They did it. It was awesome. It was like 1080p, 45 FPS range. So obviously, you know, it's expensive, right? But it was
variable. Yeah,
it was quite variable. But it was still like, hey, it works.
Yeah, they could have done it. Yeah, but I do think once some of those user generated maps get brought
I know. It would have been rough. I think
it would have folded like a card table. But yeah, that's certainly a good point. Yeah, I'm surprised we haven't really seen anything else though. That's quite interesting. But yeah, I do consider that the remastering bandwagon is going to continue into the next generation, and there's already been some kind of resistance to it in some respects, where we've had some fairly iterative upgrades, but I just think we've reached the point now where there's absolutely no reason why a good game shouldn't persist into a new generation with new features, because it's still going to be a good game. Nobody's forcing you to buy it, and there will potentially be a new market.
It is funny you bring that up, John, because maybe there's a bit of a lesson in here, because the Minecraft RTX branch, I think last week or the week before, it was announced by Microsoft that Minecraft RTX on the PC will no longer be updated. So you can still use it, but they're not going to update it with new features, and they're not going to bring it forward. Maybe at some point support will drop entirely. So that's unfortunate, but I think it probably maybe indicates to some degree like the market for some of these ray tracing remasters, especially if they involve taking a big performance hit. Perhaps there isn't maybe that much of a market for it. Indeed, they're pushing this vibrant visuals alternative, which is purely raster and runs on everything from an Xbox One to a mobile phone to a PlayStation 5, whatever. That's their approach. So that certainly is a bit of a different approach to things.
Good point.
Yeah. But in general, like, I think that games like Death Stranding 2, they already look really great with their rasterized lighting. Any improvements from ray tracing wouldn't be as impactful as, like, hypothetically looking at ray tracing enhancements in FF7 Rebirth or something, like a game where things are really falling apart, or a much older title. But yeah, I think it really is contingent, like John said, on the engine tech being there to make that work, whether that requires an engine upgrade, or in the case of, Decima, maybe there is already an kind of an incubating ray tracing implementation that Guerrilla is cooking up that they could use in an upgraded version of Death Stranding 2. Again, at the moment, we just don't know, right? But I think that the much more plausible way to go about this wouldn't actually be adopting new ray tracing tech that wasn't present in the game. It would be looking to the PC version and grabbing things from there, right? Like a parts bin of PC technology. It's like a next-gen version of Doom the Dark Ages running with, the PC's path tracing on a PlayStation 6, for instance. That's already out there. That's stuff that's been implemented. That's something they could probably do, right? As opposed to doing something completely new from the ground up.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. I think that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, let's move on. Final question. This one's from Concrete Llama. Hello, DF, and anyone who may be behind you right now. Blending into the scenery. Whenever watching the show, I'm always curious as to what's behind you on your various shelves. John's room seems to be an ever-evolving gaming haven. True. Rich's appears to be just more desk with lots of equipment used in the here and now. True, up to a point. And Oliver has a blurry shelf that alludes to a treasure trove of gaming hardware. Let's not talk about Alex for now, as he's clearly in Rich's basement with a kindly supplied window. Can we get a DF shelf tour one day? Well, John, what's going on in your background, I think a gaming haven, an ever-evolving gaming haven, is pretty bang on the money, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do constantly make changes back there and swapping hardware around, and yeah, I thought about doing a tour at some point if people really wanted to see it. But I guess the most interesting thing for a lot of people would be the way I have everything connected, maybe, because I kind of built it in a way that pretty much any screen can display most things in the room. So,
right.
Which is key to being able to use any screen. Because I have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 screens in this room alone.
Wow.
It's a lot. So,
what about your shelves, Oliver?
Oh, yes. Well, if I take a tour, well, I can, he's complaining that my shelves are blurry. I can make them much less blurry by just moving towards them, if you want to see that.
Oh, yeah, with the autofocus.
The autofocus on my camera should hopefully make this less blurry. But all these orange things are backup drives, so I save all my projects on these and archive them on these. Over here, we've got a PlayStation 3 Fat. This is a launch model, almost 20 years old. Got a Wii. That Wii. Yeah. Got an Xbox 360. You got some controllers back there. I mean, and some assorted mess, a teleprompter, things like this. So ultimately, it's not the neatest shelf in the world, which is why I try to keep it blurred out as I have now. But it is a very useful and functional shelf. In this room, I have a new apartment here, but in this room that I've been in for the past 3 months or so, this is like my own little office space. It's a small little office where I can do these recordings in and where I can work on my computer in. And I've kind of tried to outfit it with things that make it practical and also hopefully look okay on camera. But yeah, there are just a few things back there that you can see that are related to work, and then a couple things I have floating around that are just old consoles that I like to display. I've also got like PS Vitas back there. You can't really see them, but PS Vitas, 3DSs, a bunch of old hardware, INDOs, things like this.
Well, I've got what I think I've described it in the past as the cone of respectability, which is basically that anything which is in view of the camera is kept in some sort of semblance of good shape, but outside of the view that you're seeing here, it's just total carnage.
Oh boy.
And at some point, I'm going to move into another room and just have things properly organized. But there's no organization here whatsoever. So
we missed the shelf, Rich. Remember?
Yeah, the shelf could be making a return, some sort of shelf variant perhaps. But there is a lot of stuff I'd like to have on the shelf, which I've picked up. Like I got like that PSX Japan-only PS2 variant. I've got one of those, which is a really lovely piece of kit. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff I'd like to put on the shelves when they do eventually make a return. But basically, it is just consoles, a few PCs, and to my left here is basically my LG CX 48-inch. Right in front of me, the 4K 240 Alienware. And then the camera just above it with an Elgato prompter. But beyond that, my God, it's just a complete nuclear disaster of a room, which I shall not be sharing. But yeah, maybe once I've actually organized things, that will change. But that was the final question. Therefore, the end of the show. So yeah, please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you, algorithmic boosts for us. But yes, please do consider the DF supporter program early access to a lot of stuff, including the direct, a news update from the team every week, and of course high quality video downloads of everything we do and everything we have done in actual fact since late 2016. But yes, that's it. Oh, and of course store.digitalfoundry.net. Do please visit to check out and perhaps purchase our merchandising wares. But that's all from us for this week. See you next week. But in the meantime, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.